Saturday, 17th September 2016. You know, I've been using the internet since about, 1997, 1998. And at that time, the internet was, of course, nowhere near as popular as it is these days. The turn of the century, since 2000, but I'm 53 years of age. I was born on the 28th January 1963, and this is an example just to demonstrate that the way a person is, or in non-duality circles, Advaita Vedanta, a self that's had a glimpse of all that is, it simply is, speaks differently compared to the person that they thought they were prior to the collapse of that person that they used to express. A person, an individual that is in separation, expresses in a manner that's conducive to individuality, or that there's a single individual or a single person that is expressing themselves. It is quite noticeable that when there is a falling away, or there's a collapse of a sense of separation, whereby the separated self expresses as though the self-expression has its source from a singular source that is individualized, and it's separate from the appearance of life happening. There lies in the conundrum. See, there is the conundrum right there. That when there is this sense of separation from self, when that is happening, there is an individual stating that they are a person. They are an individual, and they are convinced of that. And this happens prior to the collapse or the falling away of a me. Which is why in non-duality circles it is stated that that individualized person that thinks they are a me or an individual person separate from every other person or every other me is simply a way that the apparent appearance of all that is being interpreted. So there's the paradox as well. There's another paradox insofar that we're referring to awakenings, or how the indication or the witness or the evidence that an energy shift has happened, or the manner by which that is identified. Since the question is asked, is there a moment or is there a recognition in a moment that the me has collapsed and fallen away and is no longer representing separation from all that simply is? There is the apparent appearance of self that is one with all that is, to provide an explanation about that happening, or about that event, or about that scenario that apparently appears in all this. And how is that explanation provided about the process of the collapse of the me that happens? The collapse of a me that was representing self that is one with all that is in separation. Separate. Separateness or individuality is the apparent appearance of a self that is separate from everything that appears to be life happening or aliveness. Self-realization is self-witnessing. Therefore, once there is a recognition that all that is simply is, always was, and always will be, that all that simply is, everything appearing as something, and that something is aliveness, it's energy, it is the witnessing of life happening. And when that recognition happens, there is no longer a sense of separation witnessed by the witness in all that simply is. The manner by which that is described is described and can be described in more than just one way as It is being witnessed in non-duality circles. When it is spoken of regarding that recognition that life is simply happening, and that life simply is all that is, all it simply is, simply is. Then, when non-duality is spoken of, or Advaita, then the witness will express impartial liberation in that manner to describe all that simply is. What is happening. Always has happened. Always will happen. But what is really intriguing and interesting in all this is that the apparent appearance of all that simply is will never be witnessed as something different happening. As the witness is in partial liberation, and after the collapse and falling away of the me, and after the collapse and falling away of the seeker, and then there's just the witnessing, that continues. And that is an example of the qualitative properties of consciousness. The quanta, or the qualitative properties of consciousness, is associated with infinitude or infiniteness, boundless witnessing of all that simply is. Which is how and why the apparent appearance of all that simply is never appears the same way in the now. For there is the apparent appearance of other than the nowness. The apparent appearance as though time is flowing or moments are going by. It is simply how the ultimate reality streams. It is simply how consciousness operates. Consciousness operates, always has and always will, in providing the apparent appearance of all it simply is, to appear differently in the now. In the apparent appearance of moments going by. It is similar to witnessing the flow of a river or a stream. The steady flow of consciousness of all that simply is flows like a river. And in that flow, as a metaphor, the flow of a river is a representation of time, of linear time, a threefold principle of a past, present, and future, a linear timeline that is seemingly so even after partial liberation happens, even after the collapse and the falling away of the me and the collapse and the falling away of the seeker. And there is the witness. Now, the witness represents self. The witness represents self that is one with all that is. But to a certain extent. And that extent is that there is still the apparent appearance and experience of embodiment that was once associated with a me and seeker that are no longer interfering with all that simply is, with all that is simply happening, with the apparent appearance of happenings happening, being witnessed by a witness that is partially liberated and is the self that is also part of the collective consciousness of all that simply is. It is a very simple process that happens when the aliveness is being witnessed and there is the apparent appearance of life happening. Boundless, limitless energy and aliveness, sounds, appearances, visual fields, frequencies and sounds at various pitches, visual fields with various intensities of radiance. That complexity of consciousness that simply is all of this is only complex when a complex concept or idea is presented with an attempt to explain what all this is. All this that simply is. Everything and no thing simultaneously appearing as both real and unreal. Is there a way to segregate that? Does that need to be separated and categorized? No. Because if that happens, then that is duality, which this isn't. All it simply is non-duality. And then it is also not just non-duality or duality. It is both non-duality and duality simultaneously, because all that is, it simply is everything, and even the unknowable. It is unknown that always remains a mystery. That is included with what is known. Therefore, all that is, it simply is everything, which includes the unknowable, and the apparent appearance of real reality, and the unreal, which is non-reality. So all that simply is encompasses and entails everything that is witnessed by the witness in partial liberation, and also via the apparent appearance of embodiment, which is also why there is partial liberation after the collapse of the me and seeker. And then the witness is left, which is a representation of self that is partially liberated and one with all that simply is. And yet, the experience of absolute liberation is not witnessed. That is a final step, if you will, towards absolute liberation. And there are comparisons between partial liberation and absolute liberation. Partial liberation includes not only the falling away and collapse of the me and the falling away and collapse of the seeker, and then there's just the witness. The witness is a representation in partial liberation as the self that is simply partially liberated because there is still the apparent appearance of embodiment that is also a representation of partial liberation with that witness. Each component of that degree of consciousness is self-evident. The apparent appearance of a moment when that no longer appears to be happening is when embodiment dies. The apparent appearance of embodiment falls away and collapses. And then the partial liberation gradually becomes absolute liberation. And simultaneously, the witness collapses and falls away. And the manner by which that process happens in consciousness is likened to the radiance of the star that is said to be the solar sun for an Earth, a planet. Using that metaphor as a way to describe the manner by which the final process of absolute liberation happens from partial liberation. And when that collapse, the falling away of the apparent appearance of embodiment happens, then what is left? There is the self witnessing of self that is about to become one with all that is absolutely in absolute liberation. But until that is evidential and witnessed by the witness that is still partially liberated with the apparent appearance of embodiment, the manner by which all that simply is witnessed by the witness in partial liberation continues to appear as a happening. And that happening that is happening for the witness that is in partial liberation with the apparent appearance of embodiment that degree of self, that degree of the witness in partial liberation continues and will continue until there is the death, the collapse, the falling away of the apparent appearance of embodiment. Then self remains with all that simply is, gradually transitioning and transcending from partial liberation into absolute liberation. The witness is bearing witness to the death of the apparent appearance of embodiment happening, and then begins to experience gradually approaching absolute liberation during the process of the collapse of that self-witnessing happening. The witness of the self-witnessing, that final collapse and falling away of self, is happening from partial liberation into absolute liberation, which is why it can never be proven or spoken of, simply because there is no longer partial liberation happening, there is no longer embodiment appearing as partial liberation with a witness. And this, of course, is all happening after there's been that collapse of the me and the collapse of the seeker. And the witness is still there in partial liberation with the apparent appearance of embodiment. This is how and why there is always partial liberation with the apparent appearance of embodiment and the witness via the apparent appearance of embodiment of all that simply is. Those are the distinctions between partial liberation and absolute liberation. Namaste.